The Tau don't have souls, not like we do. I like the Tau, or rather, I think they're one of the more interesting factions in Warhammer. "We're the good guys, join our enlightened empire or we'll destroy you," is just so relatable. In many ways, they're a mirror of the Imperium of Man, not in a simplistic Imperium bad, Tau good way, but rather different strategies for broadly similar goals. Both regimes require total victory with an end goal of unrivaled galactic dominance. The Tau just ask if you want to give up first and save everyone the trouble of fisticuffs. Probably because they aren't worth a damn in melee. Objectively, the Tau are a violently imperialistic society with a eugenics-based caste system that will let others live so long as they do what they're told and submit to the Tau culture and philosophy. Drop the Tau into Star Trek instead of 40K and you have the big bad for an entire series. I'm not condemning the Tau for this. I can't blame them for doing what is necessary to ensure the survival of their species and the dominance of their culture. Just as their destroying those who don't submit isn't driven by malice, their willingness to assimilate rather than exterminate alien species is a tactic, not enlightened altruism. It's notable that both the Tau and the Imperium have a default approach to other powers. The Imperium defaults to kill all xenos, which, let's face it, is exactly the right approach in some cases. Tyranids, for example. But it creates unnecessary problems in many other cases. The Tau, on the other hand, try to subvert through trade and negotiations. Sometimes it's a good approach. Sometimes they try it with orcs or chaos demons. Organizationally, the Tau are divided into 5 castes, 5 subspecies really, with the not at all pompous ethereals being the ruling caste, sort of shamans and administrators in one. What they say, the Tau do, without hesitation, as perhaps most bluntly depicted in the book Farsight, Crisis of Faith. "Now, take the bonding knife out of its sheath." Wordlessly she did so. The metal blade slid from its housing with a soft hiss. Something burned behind her eyes, in her throat, in her guts, making it hard to think. "Now kill yourself." Wellclaim reversed the knife in her hands and stabbed herself in the chest as hard as she could, burying the knife up to the hilt in her own heart. Eyes wide, she gasped out a welling glut of blood, toppled over, and spasmed her last. There's something fishy here. In fact, the entire history of the Tau is a bit suspect. The short version is they were discovered by the Imperium around 6,000 years ago. At the time, they were primitive screwheads stabbing things with sharpened rocks, and the survey team made a notation to exterminate them as a matter of course. Seeding ships were dispatched to begin the colonization of Tau, but before they arrived, freak warp storms of unimaginable fury engulfed them, and despite the presence of highly skilled navigators and captains, every vessel in the colony fleet was lost. And many whispered that this was a sign that the planet was cursed. Eventually, the Imperial bureaucracy just lost all the paperwork and forgot about the Tau, until they showed up with spaceships and plasma casters a few thousand years later. At some point during their rapid technological development, they were on the verge of wiping themselves out with endless wars, until a couple of these ethereals, that no one had ever heard of before, suddenly showed up out of nowhere and talked everyone into being bros. For the greater good. Just like that. At this time, strange lights were seen in the sky, and many believed these were signs that they were living in the last days, that extinction was nigh. Emerging from the darkness, a Tau of unusual appearance walked into the besiegers' camp, asking to see the army's commander. He was softly spoken, yet bore an undeniable authority, and the sentries to whom he had announced himself found themselves compelled to grant his request. Before too very long, they started taking over neighboring star systems. The first alien species to submit to the greater good were known as the Paktrun. I say were because they were wiped out by a plague that was extremely deadly to them, but to which the Tau were entirely immune. Fishy. But whatever outside influences may or may not be responsible for their rapid rise, the Tau are a civilization led by an aristocracy that, while fallible, makes rational decisions to further the goals they have for their civilization. Goals which require eventually co-opting or eliminating the Imperium in its entirety. And that gets to the heart of one of 40K's themes, the fight for survival against crushing odds. The relatively small Tau Empire is boxed in by hostile forces, and the Imperium is the most benign. There's no negotiating with the Tyranids, a hive of nasty buggers that consume everything in their path, or the Necrons, soulless mechanized ghouls, and of course the ever-present Orc problem. Like the Imperium, the Tau recognize that none of those other powers are static. They're not going to peacefully stay in their territory, and they need to acquire resources and create buffer zones to survive. But unlike the Imperium, the Tau Empire is too small to brute force their way through everything. Not to say it's always a prudent choice for the Imperium either. They sometimes make things much harder on themselves by being so rigidly militant. But the Imperium can afford to be wasteful and fight a few unnecessary wars on the side, lose a few million men and absorb the loss. The Tau can't. So they negotiate, they make concessions, subvert, consolidate power slowly. It's a constraint of capacity, not morality. Consequently, the Tau strategy is very much peculiar to their circumstances. It's not a model showing the rest of the galaxy that there's a better way, it's just an aggressive but vastly outmatched regional power playing to its strengths. And really, it's past the point of diminishing returns for the Tau. The further they push into the Imperium, the less fringe the planets get, the more aggressively the Imperium responds as their assessment of the threat rises, and the more overextended the Tau become. While the Imperium faces many foes on many fronts and could potentially benefit from a temporary accommodation with the Tau, borrowing some of their approach to focus on slow subversion instead of brute force, the Tau will likely be forced to fortify their expanded borders, to devote more of their societal resources toward military capacity to defend against enemies on all sides. In some sense, to become more like the Imperium. And it's a natural dance. They already have so much in common. So, back to the greater good, or the Tau Va in their language. You can hear the capitalization. It's not a general platitude of do what's right or the golden rule, but a collectivist philosophy with its own set of assumptions and priorities. It's the state religion of the Tau, the central motivating idea. Some have compared it to communism, sometimes in praise and other times in condemnation. And while there is a whiff of forced collectivization from the Tau, to ensure that the resources required were gathered in sufficient time, the Tau initiated a series of resettlement programs and so-called labor freedom decrees, moving entire populations, both alien and Tau, from their homeworlds and organizing them into work divisions. The Tau are not communists, but let's unpack that a little. We can certainly say that both communists and the Tau concept of the greater good have a focus on the collective, on the concrete individual as part of the wider society rather than the abstract individual as a singular being independent of that structure. This could get very academic and boring right quickly, so let's just keep it simple and say that the Tau and communists share an idea of societal good that requires the individual to be subordinate to the collective. But communism, at least the Marxist variety that overwhelmingly dominates communist thinking, is a materialist philosophy. It's formulated in terms of wealth distribution, of living conditions, of how political and economic power is distributed amongst the people. The Tau Va is more like a religion than a political ideology and analytical method, heavily reliant on appeals to the wisdom of the ethereals and the manifest destiny of the Tau Empire rather than dialectical models. However, like communism, it is a faith rooted in the material rather than the spiritual. The ethereals don't claim their authority from a supreme being. It's a philosophy of the physical world, just one based on somewhat subjective value judgments of whether something serves the greater good, rather than any pretense of being scientific or having a solid deterministic model. Now, I'm certainly not the first to notice that Marxism has a lot in common with eschatological religious movements. The corrupt, broken world of capitalism will collapse under its own abuses or be swept away by the revolution. In either case, an apocalyptic event in both the modern popular understanding of destructive and in terms of revealing truths. After which we dispense with the exploitive hierarchies of the old world and welcome the workers' paradise, a secular materialist kingdom of heaven. That's not what the Tau are about. Their faith, the Tau Va, is not a transitional thing. The ethereals will not wither away, and the earth caste will not seize the means of production and usher in a new age. You are the means of production. Get back to work for the greater good. As the ethereals, the governing high priest determine it. Which is not all that dissimilar from the faith built around the emperor and the broad idea of mankind. Both civilizations function on a model of aristocratic authoritarianism built around unquestionable religious doctrine. The Tau even mirror the Emperor, physically dead on his throne, with an ongoing ruse involving AI and holograms to hide the fact that one of their greatest and most revered ethereals has been dead for years, holding up an idol as a source of legitimacy. Anva is already dead, slain by an Imperial assassin. The ethereals have since employed solid light technology coupled with AI personality matrices to give the ethereal supreme a simulacra of life beyond death that has, thus far, fooled the worshipful masses. The labyrinthine deception must never be revealed. The Tau represent not so much something new or a better way for the Imperium to emulate, but an earlier point on the curve that mankind has already taken. Their whole vibrant race with a grand destiny, look at our cool machine shtick, is what got the Imperium to where it is now. The Tau are kind of like the new humans, and they're at the tail end of their age of enlightenment, colonizing the lands of their less advanced neighbors, benignly, helping to civilize them, of course, taking up the blue man's burden for the greater good of all. They have great faith in progress. They rush into artificial intelligence, even building autonomous war machines to fight beside them. Humanity has already been there millennia ago, and it wasn't all rainbows and unicorns. The lore addresses this in a few ways. Inquisitor Gallius was more alarmed by the Tau than any of his brethren. What struck him most about them was that their naivete, technological prowess, and unwavering belief in progress reminded him of what he had read of mankind in its glory days, a time known as the Age of Technology. Although much of that period is unknown, some believe that mankind's intellectual hubris and unworthy reliance on machines and artificial intelligences brought about the dreaded Age of Strife, a nightmare time of horror and violence. If the Tau were indeed upon that same path, then they represented a larger threat to the Imperium of man, and indeed the whole galaxy, than any would easily believe. Humanity has already passed through a Golden Age Star Trek utopian phase. We were colonizing the galaxy, we had robots to do the boring stuff, and not all contact with xenos led to war. Things were great. Until the robots turned on us, warp storms erupted all over the place, isolating planets and making interstellar travel essentially impossible, and of course, psychers, humans with strong connections to the warp, began to appear, which led to malicious warp entities entering into the physical world. Not only did the technological basis of our civilization fail, but actual demons were suddenly a real problem. We can blame the elves another time. This started to turn around with the rise of the Imperium, but, well, mistakes were made, and the Emperor's grand plan has been a broken, festering mess ever since. And the Tau appear headed toward their own Age of Strife. They're optimistic and expansionist. They had a string of wins until they bumped up against the Imperium. Now they've hit the wall, and despite their apparent lack of anything equivalent to human psychers, the Tau are not immune to demonic possession. Notably poor Malachor, possessed by a minor servant of the chaos god Tzeentch. Also noteworthy that this particular demon's curse was a compulsion to speak truth. Before being slain, it said this: "They are playing you for a fool. Your whole culture is built on lies. The ethereals, they are using you all like puppets. It was they who murdered Wellclaim, not I. It was they who killed your precious master." The dying rant of a demon, even one supposedly incapable of lying, is suspect, but it does fit with some other data points. I think it's worth asking whether the warp storms that protected Tau, the strange lights in the sky preceding the arrival of the ethereals with their ability to sway the rest of their people, their rapid mastery of technology, are part of some long-running plan. For example, the aforementioned Tzeentch, chaotic god of change, grand conspirator and changer of ways, a sneaky beast with a record of long-term complex plans. Which brings up another point that could be profoundly significant to the Tau and the Imperium. There is another factor here. One of the Tau military leaders, Oshova, or Commander Farsight, has broken away from the rest of the Tau Empire with his sizable force and established a few independent colonies known as the Farsight Enclaves. The principal difference between them and the rest of the Tau is that the Enclaves don't have and don't want any ethereals, and consequently are free of whatever method of influence the ethereals employ. Perhaps the caste would be better off seeking a natural harmony, thought Oshova, without the ethereal caste moderating and controlling them at all times. Their actions in the past had bordered on despicable. Their war crimes and cold-hearted politics had seemed necessary and wise at the time, but now, in retrospect, were exposed as deplorable. It was said that Master Anva was able to convince any Tau he spoke to of the justice of his actions, no matter how drastic. Was it possible that the ethereals had been influencing the other castes through some means other than logic and loyalty? The more Oshova thought about it, the more he recalled incidents where the Tau had acted with unnatural obedience in the presence of the ethereals. Even the fundamental myth of the Fiautan, where the ethereals appeared from the stars to broker peace between the warring castes over the course of a single night, spoke more of an external force acting upon Tau society than an internal resolution. So far, the practical effect is just two slightly divergent Tau societies, one effectively a theocracy and the other a military junta. But the enclaves are doing just fine without their magical priest kings, and the possibilities for a new branch of Tau society and philosophy are wide open. Being on their own, having to solve their own problems, the enclaves are even more like us. More broadly, the Tau Empire has expanded in a series of campaigns. Spheres of expansion, they call them, as they spread out from their homeworld. For the first 3 spheres, they had no faster-than-light travel. The 4th sphere was the first to utilize the warp for travel, and it didn't go as planned. They unleashed some warp nasties, the entire expedition was thought to have been lost, and naturally the ethereals covered it all up, complete with fake reports of grand success. It's for the greater good that the plebes don't have their confidence shaken or start asking questions. Only not all of them were lost. Years later, the survivors made contact via wormhole, which the Tau quickly proceeded to fortify. Now, here's the curious thing. Many of them reported an entity leading them out. Ideas and emotions have a sort of substance in the warp, and much like the chaos gods formed by the collective thoughts of the creatures in the galaxy, the Tau of the 4th Sphere expedition encountered a sort of god of the Tau Va, a personification of their greater good. But the Tau themselves have very little impact in the warp. These Tau know nothing of nameless doubt, of existential fear, or the hideous reflections that even the meekest human souls can cast into the hell dimension of the warp. They are not a psychically active race, or if they are so weak that even I find it difficult to read their empiric presence. What blessed ignorance that must be, to live unthreatened by one's own rapacious shadow. The Tau don't have souls, not like we do. And so they believe that it was the non-Tau vassal races that created this entity. The god of the Tau faith is not of the Tau. And the survivors started to find the mere presence of even loyal aliens disruptive. But it was in combat that the change was most pronounced. The warriors of the 4th Sphere expansion partook in these purges with unrestrained eagerness, to the astonished disapproval of their kin. They displayed a ruthlessness quite unheard of amongst adherents to the Code of Fire, slaughtering prisoners with fusillades of pulse rifle and disregarding, even intentionally maximizing, any loss of non-Tau life. After a spree of killings and a bloody Kroot uprising upon the colony of Kisan, all alien auxiliaries were removed from contingents of 4th Sphere Tau. So if the warp is as nasty as it is due to eons of brutal war and hate in the galaxy, and this group of Tau that traveled through the warp emerged with heightened xenophobia, much more hateful and violent toward the other than they went in, it does not bode well for the future of the multi-species structure of the Tau Empire as they expand. And what of humanity, who has used the warp for thousands of years? Perhaps the irrational brutality of the Imperium is the result of some chaos taint, an infection of cruelty and malice festering in the entire civilization, perhaps even the species itself at that point. This in turn raises questions about the Emperor's real plan, with his Webway project to bypass the warp before his asshole sons foobarred that. But that's a topic for another time. For now, it's another thread suggesting that the Tau are on the same path the Imperium already took, sort of mankind's little brother that's about to make the same mistakes. Of course, this is Warhammer. It's primarily a game and locked into its tropes. While in practical policy terms, the Imperium could mitigate a lot of its problems by simply making marginal improvements to the lives of its citizens, but in terms of the game, the Imperium can't start a series of social programs to deliver better food, housing, and working conditions, and a series of public works to give them nice parks to spend time with their families during the off hours. A liberalizing, nuanced, and flexible Imperium wouldn't be 40k anymore. Now, some have argued that the first Tau Codex portrays them as filling exactly that role, even as objectively good, which I find to be an exaggeration. Even in that text, the Tau are kind of shady. It is speculated that they exert some kind of pheromone-based or latent psychic control over the other castes, as loyalty to the ethereals is absolute and unswerving. If an ethereal were of such a mind, he could order another Tau to kill himself and would be obeyed immediately. Still, by 40k standards, they're almost hippies in the original release, though they're gradually learning how the universe around them works. It's not that they're being retconned, it's just that they're not morons. But there's something else in this lore, something that the critics who gripe about it glorifying fascism or being right-wing miss. The Tau can easily be looked at as a sort of grimdark liberalism. Sure, they're ruled by a creepy genetic aristocracy and try to colonize everyone they meet, but it's a British IP after all. Modern sensibilities frown on the whole civilizing the savage by force thing, but compared to everyone else in 40k, they're bleeding heart liberals. But this is all set in a world where evil exists. Not as an abstract moral concept, but a sapient force capable of planning, possessed of intelligence and intent. There really are evil gods. Demons can enter the world and slaughter people, they can possess people, and the galaxy is full of more mundane monsters as well. The story of the Tau up to the current lore illustrates something about liberal ideologies that our post-Enlightenment worldview shies away from, and I think might be part of why some people react so negatively to 40k in the current political environment and are so bent on co-opting it in various ways. I'm speaking broadly in the sense of classical liberalism and the entire political assumptions of the modern Western world, not specific parties or whatnot, cross-spectrum here. Democrats, Republicans, Labor, Social Democrats, all part of that same liberal tradition. Liberalism works if one of two conditions exist. Either your opponents are also part of that liberal tradition and self-bind by the same rules of good faith negotiation, respect for legal norms, basic moral codes and such, or you are so much more powerful than your opponent that you can push them around without having to commit to total war, letting you nominally adhere to those values and norms because the enemy just isn't strong enough to make them a hindrance. As soon as the fight escalates to a war for survival against an enemy that doesn't care about being perceived as reasonable or the good guy, being judged by the press or posterity or any other earthly power, only destroying you, being a good liberal gets you killed. The Imperium has been in that state for thousands of years. If they turn into social democrats and try to make accommodations, they all die horribly. Demons. Actual hell for all practical purposes. The much younger, more isolated, and more naive Tau have just reached that point of realization. It's going to change them. The fourth sphere Tau, being so much more brutal and hostile toward the alien, is a great metaphor for that breakdown because it's not just them. It's not that they'll just choose to be assholes. Just like the Imperium, they're reacting to external conditions and experience. They're reflecting the universe they live in. Despite the weak Tau souls that shine dimly in the warp, they're enmeshed in a universe that has become twisted and cruel throughout eons of horrific wars and weird sadistic elf shenanigans. They have to fight to survive, but the act of engaging in that fight fuels that evil in a vicious cycle. And the lore works precisely because there's no faction that stands above as a shining beacon of virtue. It isn't some platitude about how just being the better person and taking the high road solves the problem and all these civilizations that have been trying to slaughter each other for millennia are just belligerent idiots. Instead, it says, look, it took a long time to fuck things up this badly, and it's going to take a long time to fix it, but none of this matters right now because we have to deal with those orcs at the gate. Everything you do to fight off the things that are trying to kill you today feeds the thing that'll be trying to kill you 1,000 years from now. Of course, that does open the slim possibility that the Tau, with their minimal impact on the warp, if they wiped out everyone else and just chilled for 1,000,000 years or so, maybe the worst of the malicious energy would dissipate and the warp would be a less horrific force. Perhaps the ethereals have already gamed out a long-term plan to slaughter their way to the greater good. So maybe they're a little like communists.